Kyle Owens had poured his heart into building his company from scratch. Every brick, every policy, every person hired was a reflection of his values. For years, the business had grown steadily. 9 thriving locations, a strong customer base, and a reputation for fairness. But recently, something had shifted. Sales weren't falling, but they weren't growing either. More concerning were the growing complaints from customers and the quiet exodus of good employees. Something intangible, yet deeply wrong, was unfolding under his nose. When Kyle brought up his concerns with his district managers, they all parroted the same tired excuse. People just don't want to work anymore. But that didn't sit right with him. Kyle had always believed that if you treat people with dignity, they'll give you their best. If that was no longer happening, the issue wasn't laziness, it was leadership. And maybe, just maybe, that failure started with him. So Kyle made a choice most CEOs wouldn't dare consider. He would go undercover. He had never met most of the employees who worked the front lines of his stores. That was by design. He trusted his management team to take care of the day-to-day. But now, that trust felt like negligence. With the help of a professional makeup artist, he transformed himself. Aged 20 years, graying hair, wrinkles etched deep into his skin, a convincing limp added to make him seem worn down by life. Dressed in second-hand clothes and thick glasses, he became Ken Owens, a humble man applying for a janitorial position at one of his own locations. The moment he walked in for his first shift, the disconnect hit him like a punch to the gut. The store manager, Rick, didn't offer a handshake or even a proper greeting. "Janitor, right?" Rick mumbled, flipping through a clipboard without lifting his eyes. "Mops in the back, bathrooms first." Kyle nodded silently and got to work. No welcome, no warmth, just commands barked out like he was a burden. As he moved through the store with his mop and trash bag, he started to listen, not just with his ears, but with his heart. The employees were stretched thin. During the chaotic lunch rush, only 3 workers tried to handle what clearly needed 6. A young cashier named Brianna looked like she was holding back tears as she rang up customer after customer. Behind her, a cook named Lewis wiped sweat from his brow, clearly overwhelmed. "Rick, we need another person on the line," Brianna called out, her voice trembling with urgency. Rick, sipping on a soda near the register like a bored spectator, rolled his eyes. "Figure it out," he said coldly. Kyle felt his jaw tighten. That was the first red flag, but it wouldn't be the last. Later, during his break, Kyle wandered into the modest employee cafeteria. He bought a sandwich from a vending machine and sat alone at a table in the corner, trying to process everything he'd seen. Other employees came and went, chatting in groups, but no one acknowledged him. He was invisible now, a ghost among the very people his success had once depended on. Then someone approached. An older janitor, maybe in his late 50s, carrying a paper bag lunch. He scanned the room and made his way over. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, voice gentle, eyes kind. Kyle shook his head. "Go ahead." The man sat and began unwrapping his sandwich, glancing at Kyle's uniform. "New guy?" he asked. "Yeah." "Just started today," Kyle replied. "I'm George," the man said, extending a hand. Kyle took it. "Been here 10 years, George continued. "Never seen you before. You transfer from another store?" Kyle hesitated, then nodded, something like that. George studied him for a moment, then chuckled. "You don't talk much, huh?" "That's all right, just know this place ain't what it used to be." That stopped Kyle cold. "What do you mean?" he asked carefully. George sighed and looked down at his sandwich. "Used to feel like family here. Managers cared. People mattered. But now, management just wants numbers. Good folks quit. The ones who stay, they're just bodies." "Rick?" George shook his head. "He looks out for himself. That's it." Kyle's heart sank. It was worse than he thought. George took a bite of his sandwich, chewing in silence for a while before asking, "You got kids?" Kyle, caught off guard, paused, then nodded. "Yeah, 2, grown now." George nodded knowingly. "That's good, family's everything." Then, folding the wrapper neatly, he looked Kyle in the eye. "You ever work a job like this before?" Kyle didn't answer right away. Inside, a war was brewing. He had always believed he was building something good, something that gave people more than just a paycheck. But sitting across from George, listening to the tired resignation in his voice, Kyle saw the truth. Somewhere along the way, the culture he built had been hollowed out. And that failure was his. The silence between them was heavy, but meaningful. Kyle's sandwich sat half-eaten, forgotten. His mind was too full. This wasn't just about poor management. It was about broken trust, lost purpose, and a company that had quietly lost its soul. And now, Kyle knew, he had to earn it back. Kyle chose his words with care, balancing truth with discretion. "Not exactly," he said, keeping his tone measured. "But I've been around long enough to know when people are unhappy." George exhaled slowly, rubbing his calloused hands together. "Yeah, that's the truth." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "Look, I don't know who you are, but I'll say this. Keep your head down. Don't ask too many questions. Rick, he's the kind of guy who doesn't like being challenged. You cross him, and he'll make your life hell in a heartbeat." Kyle offered no reaction on the outside, but inside his thoughts were racing. Rick wasn't just indifferent. He was toxic. A bully with power. If fear was the glue holding the team together, the culture he had once fought to build was in ruins. Employees weren't just overworked. They were afraid, silenced, disrespected. Before he could reply, the break room door creaked open. Rick stood there, arms crossed like a warden, eyes scanning the room before landing on Kyle and George. "You two done with your little lunch date?" he sneered. "Trash is piling up. Let's go, Grandpa." George didn't react, didn't flinch. He just crumpled his paper bag, gave Kyle a quiet nod, and walked out. Kyle followed, gripping the mop handle like a lifeline. Rage simmered beneath his calm facade. The rest of the shift unfolded like a slow-motion disaster. Every corner of the store buzzed with barely controlled chaos. Customers waited, impatient and irritated. Brianna's face was pale and drawn as she tried to juggle orders that kept piling up. Lewis, working the grill alone, was visibly overheating. Rick didn't move to help. He just stood near the front, occasionally tapping on his phone, sipping from the same cup like he was watching a show. And it happened. Brianna, hands trembling from exhaustion, dropped a cup of soda. It exploded across the counter, spraying the floor with sticky liquid. Rick didn't even lift his eyes. "Clean that up," he barked. Kyle was already moving. Mop in hand, he knelt beside the counter, noticing how Brianna's hands still shook as she tried to fill the next drink. "You okay?" he asked, keeping his voice low. She nodded too fast. "Yeah, just a long day." But Kyle saw it. It wasn't just fatigue. It was burnout, isolation. She was a young woman fighting a silent battle while her supposed leader sipped soda and watched her drown. Later, in the quiet of the storage room, Kyle found George wiping down shelves. "Tell me more about Rick," Kyle said, leaning on his mop like a cane. George didn't look up. "What's there to tell?" he muttered. "Cuts our hours, then yells when we can't keep up, treats people like dirt. But the folks upstairs, either they don't know or they don't care." Kyle clenched his jaw. "And you? Why stay?" George wiped his hands on a rag, exhaling with a tired heaviness that only decades of struggle could shape. "Got a granddaughter, she's 9. Her mom, my daughter, she's between jobs. I help where I can. I can't afford to walk away. And there it was, responsibility and quiet sacrifice, the kind that doesn't make headlines but keeps families afloat, the kind that traps good people in bad places. A sudden crash broke the moment. Both men rushed toward the front. Near the register, Lewis was on the floor, gripping his wrist, pain twisting his face. A tray of food lay scattered beside him. Rick loomed overhead, arms crossed. "Get up," he snapped. Lewis tried to push himself upright, wincing. Brianna knelt beside him, panic on her face. "I think he's hurt." "He's fine," Rick scoffed, "just clumsy." Kyle stepped forward before he could think better of it. "He should sit down." Rick's eyes narrowed. "Who asked you?" Kyle ignored him and crouched beside Lewis. "What happened?" Lewis swallowed hard. "Burned my wrist earlier." Didn't say anything. Then I slipped. Kyle gently inspected the injury. The skin was angry red, blisters beginning to form. "You need to get this looked at," he said firmly. Rick rolled his eyes. "He's not going anywhere. We're already short-staffed." Kyle rose slowly. "So you'd rather risk a serious injury than let him get medical attention?" Rick's face hardened. "You don't get paid to have opinions, Janitor." The room went still. Employees had stopped moving, watching, listening. Then George stepped forward. "He's right. Lewis needs a break." Rick turned sharply, ready to bark, but before he could, Brianna's voice rang out, clearer than before. "If he's not getting medical attention, I'm calling corporate." Rick whirled around. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," she said, straightening her posture. Kyle saw it then, the moment Rick realized he no longer had control. The spell had broken. Rick grunted. "Fine. Go. But don't expect special treatment when you come back." Lewis didn't wait. He limped toward the back, and Brianna followed. Rick turned to Kyle, venom in his voice. "You're on thin ice, old man." Kyle said nothing, but inside he knew. Rick's clock was ticking. That night, Kyle couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the faces of his employees etched into his thoughts. Brianna, too young to carry this much weight. Lewis pushing through pain no one should ignore. George, quietly sacrificing so his family could survive. And Rick, the rot at the core of it all. This company wasn't supposed to be like the others. He'd built it to be different, but now it was just another soul-crushing job for people who deserved better. At dawn, Kyle arrived early. The store was quiet, filled with the smell of coffee and grease. Employees filed in, sleep still in their eyes. George was already at work, wiping tables in the dining area. Kyle grabbed a rag and joined him. "You don't have to do that," George said, glancing over. "Figured I'd make myself useful," Kyle replied. They worked in silence, side by side, a quiet rhythm forming between them. Then George spoke, voice low and cautious. "Rick's got it out for you now." Kyle met his gaze. "I noticed. He doesn't forget. You stood up to him yesterday. That means he's coming for you today." Kyle nodded slowly. He had no illusions. Rick would push harder now, but so would he. And as if summoned by the tension in the air, Rick's voice sliced through the morning calm. "Cut in my office. Now." Kyle set the rag down and followed. The battle had just begun. The office was cramped and stale, cluttered with stacks of neglected paperwork, a dusty computer that looked like it hadn't been used in weeks, and unopened supply boxes shoved into the corners like forgotten promises. Rick leaned against the desk, arms crossed tightly across his chest, a smirk barely concealing the venom in his tone. "You think you're smart?" he asked, eyes locked onto Kyle with a hard, probing stare. Kyle stood in silence. Rick pressed on, stepping closer. You've been here, what, 2 days? And already, you're sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." His voice was a low growl now. "I don't care where you worked before, but in this store, I run the show, not you." Kyle met his gaze without blinking, calm, unmoved. "I wasn't trying to step on toes," he said evenly. "Just helping where I could." Rick scoffed, his expression souring. "Helping?" He pushed off the desk, advancing on Kyle. "You embarrass me in front of my staff." Kyle kept his tone grounded, never rising. Lewis was hurt. He needed medical attention. "You don't get to decide that." "I do," Rick snapped, jabbing a finger at Kyle. Kyle didn't flinch. And what if he had collapsed? What if he'd passed out mid-shift in the kitchen? Would that still be just a little problem? You'd be dealing with more than embarrassment. You'd be responsible. Rick's face darkened, his hands balled into fists. "You don't get it. This place runs because I make the hard calls. If I let every little issue slow us down, we'd never survive the day." Kyle studied him in silence. He wasn't just incompetent. He truly believed what he was saying. To Rick, cruelty was efficiency. Indifference was management. There was nothing more to say. Rick grabbed a clipboard from the desk and thrust it into Kyle's chest. "You're on bathroom duty all day. Since you like being helpful, you can scrub toilets to your heart's content." Kyle took the clipboard without a word. He saw through the ploy. This wasn't about punishment. It was about control, humiliation, breaking him down. But Rick had no idea who he was trying to break. Kyle had spent years doing the dirty work, scrubbing floors, washing dishes. He had built this business from those very trenches, and no petty tyrant would undo that resolve. For the next few hours, Kyle worked. He scrubbed sinks, emptied trash, mopped floors, and all the while, he watched, observed, measured the weight of the culture he had once been so proud of. Brianna was alone at the register again, barely keeping up. Her body moved on autopilot, her eyes dulled by fatigue. Lewis hadn't returned, and George, always pushing through, moved slower than usual, occasionally pausing to rub his aching lower back when he thought no one was watching. By lunchtime, Kyle's mind was made up. He found Brianna near the soda machine, her arms full of cups. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. She jumped slightly, caught off guard, then nodded, too quickly. "Yeah, just tired." Kyle waited, then asked the question he had been holding back. "Why do you stay?" She hesitated. Her guard dropped for a beat. "Because I have to," she said. "I'm saving for college. There's no backup plan. I need the money." Kyle nodded slowly, then asked, "If you could change one thing about this place, what would it be?" Brianna looked around instinctively, as if worried Rick was lurking nearby. Then, in a whisper, "Respect. We work hard, but no one treats us like we matter. People quit all the time, and it's like no one notices. Rick treats us like we're nothing." Those words hit Kyle harder than he expected. Later, near the back of the store, he found George organizing supplies. "Got a second?" Kyle asked. George wiped his hands on his apron. "Sure. What's on your mind?" Kyle stepped closer. "If someone higher up actually listened, what would you say?" George chuckled, shaking his head. "I'd say it's too late. Guys like Rick, they don't change. And the people above him, they don't see what happens down here. We're just names on a schedule." Kyle held his gaze. What if they did see? George studied him for a long, heavy moment. "Then I'd tell them, clean house. Get rid of the rot before it spreads any further." Kyle nodded, the final confirmation he needed. The decision was no longer just his. It belonged to every voice he'd heard this week. He walked toward the front of the store, each step steady with purpose. Employees were scattered across the space, working fast, eyes down. Rick stood at the register, scrolling on his phone. Kyle stopped in the center of the dining area. He removed his glasses, then the wig. A wave of stillness swept over the room. Every movement halted. Rick looked up, confusion twisting into disbelief. Brianna gasped. George dropped the rag he'd been holding. Kyle drew a breath that filled his lungs with resolve. "I'm Kyle Owens," he said, voice echoing through the restaurant. "And this company is mine." Silence gripped the room. Employees stared, stunned. The janitor they had worked beside was their CO. Rick's face drained of color, then flushed with something darker. Kyle let the silence stretch, giving everyone time to absorb the truth. Then he turned to Rick. "I've spent the last few days seeing how this store actually runs when I'm not around," he said. "And what I saw? It was disgraceful." Rick stiffened. "This isn't the place for that conversation." "No, Rick," Kyle interrupted, voice steady. "This is exactly the place. Right here, in front of the people you've mistreated." Brianna looked to George, eyes wide. Other employees stopped moving entirely, waiting. Rick straightened, forcing a nervous laugh. "Look, I don't know what you think you saw. Running a store isn't easy. We're short-staffed. These kids today, they don't want to work. I do what I have to do to keep things moving." Kyle didn't flinch. "That's your justification? That's why Lewis had to work through an injury? Why Brianna's doing the work of 3 people? Why George, who's given 10 years of his life to this place, still has to tell new hires to keep their heads down to survive your leadership?" For the first time, Rick's confidence faltered. His eyes flicked nervously to the employees now gathering, listening. "You don't understand," Rick stammered. "You sit in an office while we deal with real problems." Kyle took one step closer, his voice lowered just enough to draw Rick in. "I built this company from scratch. I've worked every role you see here. I scrubbed floors, I cleaned bathrooms, I handled late shifts when no one else would. So don't stand there and tell me I don't understand what it's like." Rick's posture stiffened, his voice turning sharp again. "So you think you can just waltz in here and judge my decisions? You think it's that simple?" "The pressure?" Kyle's eyes darkened, voice calm but resolute. "Your job wasn't to crack under it. Your job was to lead, to protect your team, to lift them, not break them." Rick's mouth opened, ready to defend himself, but Kyle cut him off with a firm shake of the head. "You're done here," he said. "Pack your things." Rick's composure shattered. "You can't just fire me." "I can," Kyle replied, voice like stone. "And I just did." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Every employee in the store seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what Rick would do next. For a heartbeat, it looked like he might explode. But instead, his jaw tensed and he shoved his phone into his pocket. "You'll regret this," he muttered under his breath, then turned and stormed toward the back. Kyle let out a slow exhale. Around him, the silence in the restaurant was thick, heavy, with tension, disbelief, and slowly, something else. Relief. "This isn't just about Rick," Kyle said, turning to the gathered employees. His voice carried through the space, steady and full of conviction. "This is about all of you, about the way you've been treated, the conditions you've been forced to work under. That changes, starting today." Brianna blinked, her mind struggling to catch up. "What does that mean?" Kyle looked around, meeting every pair of eyes he could. "It means you'll be treated with the respect you deserve. You'll get the support you need. No more burnout. No more silence. You are not disposable, not here." George, standing at the edge of the group with arms folded, studied him. And how do we know things won't go right back to the way they were after you leave? Kyle nodded. The skepticism was earned. Because I'm not leaving this store the way I found it. I'll be making immediate changes, starting with promoting leadership that actually cares. Like who? Brianna asked, her voice small, uncertain. Kyle let a smile break through for the first time that day. George. The older man looked stunned. Me? You've been here longer than anyone, Kyle said. You've watched over this place even when no one was watching you. You've protected people. That's what real leadership is. George shook his head, still in disbelief. I'm just a janitor. No, Kyle said gently. You're a leader. You've always been one. Now it's time to lead out in the open. The energy shifted again. Employees whispered among themselves, the air thick with something new. Possibility. George rubbed his chin, thinking, then nodded slowly. If it means making this place better, I'm in. Kyle turned to Brianna. And you've shown more strength than most people twice your age. You didn't stay quiet. That's what this place needs in a leader. She hesitated. Me? You see the problems. You speak up. You've earned it. She swallowed, then nodded. I won't let you down. I know, Kyle said. Just then, Lewis walked back into the store, his wrist wrapped in fresh bandages. He glanced around, puzzled by the tension and new atmosphere. What did I miss? He asked. Brianna smiled, eyes gleaming. Everything. Kyle turned to the rest of the staff. This is just the beginning. I'll be implementing changes at every location. No more stores run like this ever again. The employees exchanged glances. Some still wore expressions of disbelief, but it was melting. Slowly, cautiously, hands began to clap, not for the fall of Rick, but for what came after. For being seen. Kyle stood among them, feeling something unfamiliar and powerful settle into his chest. He had come undercover looking for cracks in the foundation. What he found was a rot that had taken hold. But now he saw the way forward. As the applause faded, Kyle walked to the back office. Rick was inside, stuffing papers into a battered briefcase, his movements stiff with resentment. Kyle leaned against the door frame, watching for a moment. You had a choice, Kyle said. You could have led with integrity. But you used your position to make your life easier by making everyone else's harder. Rick didn't look up. Spare me. You think replacing me fixes anything? These people will walk all over you the moment you start giving them what they want. Kyle crossed his arms. That's where you went wrong. You never understood leadership. It's not about control, it's about trust. And you lost theirs a long time ago. Rick laughed bitterly. Trust doesn't keep a business afloat. Tough decisions do. No, Kyle said. Tough decisions don't mean abuse. They don't mean creating fear. You could have built something lasting. Instead, you became the problem. Rick slammed his briefcase shut. You're making a mistake. Kyle's voice didn't waver. The mistake was letting you run this store as long as I did. Rick stormed past him without another word. The doors swung shut behind him. Silence followed. Final, heavy, but also clean, like the end of a storm. Kyle turned back toward the front of the store. Employees were still gathered, some slowly returning to their stations. He made his way to George. You meant what you said? George asked, his voice quieter than before. Kyle nodded, every word. George wiped his hands on his apron. If I'm stepping up, I'm doing it right. That means change people can see. That's why I chose you, Kyle replied. First thing, George said, straightening up. We fix the pay. People aren't going to stay if we keep bleeding them dry. I've already started reviewing wages, Kyle said. Starting here, no more skeleton crews just to save a few bucks. Brianna stepped forward. End schedules. People are burning out. Shifts are unpredictable. We need structure. What would you change? Kyle asked. Set schedules, backup plans for time off, and we cross-train. No more one person doing the job of three. Kyle nodded. Make a list. You'll have the resources. Lewis added, the kitchen gear's falling apart. We're wasting time fixing things that should have been replaced years ago. Kyle made a mental note. Send me a report. If it needs fixing, it gets fixed. The skepticism hadn't vanished, but it was changing. They weren't just hearing words. They were seeing action. Real, tangible effort. George crossed his arms. What about the other stores? If it's like this here? Kyle's expression hardened. I'm visiting every single one. No more second-hand reports from people who only care about their numbers. I need to see the truth with my own eyes. Brianna nodded. That's how we'll know it's real. Kyle faced them all one last time. This is just the start. I can't fix everything in a day, but I'll fight every day to make this the company it was meant to be. A place people are proud to work, not one they're trying to escape from. The room shifted again. Conversations resumed, but this time they weren't whispers. They were purposeful, energized. The weight was lifting. Kyle turned to George. You ready? George exhaled deeply. Yeah, he said. Let's do this right. Kyle extended his hand. George shook it firmly. The work had only begun, but for the first time in a long time, Kyle knew they were finally building something worth believing in.